Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nathan, and today we're covering the worst Karen deaths ever recorded. From a Karen stepping into the street to confront an ice cream truck, to a Karen standing on a step stool handling exposed wiring in her kitchen, thinking it was a simple fix before the danger became clear. It was June 24, 2018 in Stockton, California. By 3 p.m., temperatures had climbed to 94 degrees, and heat shimmered above the residential pavement. Traffic was light along the neighborhood street as an ice cream truck made its afternoon rounds. Zenda Quell, 44, worked at a regional insurance office and was known among colleagues for her insistence on specific procedures and her unwillingness to compromise on matters she deemed unfair. She had a reputation for lengthy complaints about parking violations, service wait times, and perceived slights in customer interactions. That Sunday, she was walking with two children, ages 6 and 8, along a residential block on the eastern side of the city. The children were visiting relatives, and Zenda had offered to take them out for the afternoon. The ice cream truck had stopped near the curb approximately 30 feet ahead. Parents and kids gathered around the service window, forming a loose line. Zenda approached the vendor and began pointing at the truck's position relative to the sidewalk. She insisted the vehicle was parked too close to a driveway entrance and demanded free ice cream cones as compensation for what she described as a safety hazard. The vendor, a man in his mid-30s who had been operating the route for 3 years, declined and explained that the truck was legally parked. Zenda raised her voice. Several parents turned to watch. After a brief exchange lasting roughly 2 minutes, the vendor closed the service window. The truck's engine started, and it began rolling forward at a slow pace down the street. Zenda stepped off the curb and into the roadway. She continued gesturing toward the departing truck, her attention fixed on its rear bumper as it moved away at roughly 8 to 10 miles per hour. She walked around the back of the vehicle and into the opposite lane without looking in either direction. A second ice cream truck was approaching from the other direction at approximately 20 to 25 miles per hour, consistent with residential traffic flow. Witnesses later reported that Zenda never turned her head toward the oncoming vehicle. She was still focused on the first truck when she stepped directly into the path of the second. The driver of the approaching truck saw her and immediately applied the brakes. The tires skidded briefly on the hot asphalt, leaving visible marks that investigators later documented and photographed for their report. The vehicle swerved slightly to the right, but there was insufficient stopping distance to avoid impact. The front bumper struck Zenda at hip level. The impact knocked her onto the hood before she fell back onto the pavement. The truck continued forward a short distance before coming to a complete stop. Bystanders shouted and rushed toward the scene. One person called 911 immediately. The two children stood on the sidewalk, motionless and silent. The driver of the second truck exited the vehicle and stood several feet away, visibly shaken and pale. Several witnesses gathered around but did not move Zenda. She remained on the pavement, unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Paramedics assessed Zenda at the scene and transported her to a nearby hospital. She was pronounced dead later that afternoon. The cause of death was listed as traumatic internal injuries, consistent with blunt force trauma sustained in the collision. Investigators reviewed witness statements and examined the roadway. The second driver submitted to testing and showed no signs of alcohol or drug use. No citations were issued. The official report cited pedestrian failure to yield and inattention as contributing factors. The first vendor provided a statement to police but was not implicated. The children were released to relatives later that evening, escorted away from the scene by family members. It was July 14, 2016, when the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Scottsdale, turning the asphalt into waves of shimmering heat. The temperature had climbed to 112 degrees by early afternoon, the kind of oppressive heat that made breathing feel like inhaling from an oven. The Costco parking lot was packed beyond capacity, cars circling endlessly as weekend shoppers took advantage of summer sales. Grella Tusk, a 47-year-old woman who worked in property sales, pulled her white luxury SUV into the lot just after 2 in the afternoon. She wore a pink velour tracksuit and oversized sunglasses, having spent her morning in heated discussions with her neighborhood association. She spotted a family loading groceries into their sedan near the entrance. Brella immediately stopped her vehicle perpendicular to the space, blocking the lane with her turn signal flashing. From the opposite direction, a younger woman in a compact car approached the same spot. Brella laid on her horn as the family continued their loading, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. When the sedan finally pulled out, the compact car quickly maneuvered into the space. Brella threw her SUV into park in the middle of the traffic lane, engine still running, and stepped out into the scorching heat. She approached the other vehicle with her phone raised, filming as she confronted the driver, who remained inside with the doors locked. Behind her, abandoned SUV, traffic began backing up as several cars waited in the lane. For 3 minutes, she stood in the direct sunlight as shoppers began recording the confrontation. Then, she returned to her vehicle, declaring her intention to wait as long as necessary. Her SUV sat with the engine running and the driver's door wide open, air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the extreme heat pouring through the opening. The temperature outside had climbed to 114 degrees. Despite the running air conditioning, the open door provided little relief, as hot air and reflected heat from the asphalt continued flooding the interior. The sun beat directly through the windshield and open door, radiating heat into the cabin like a furnace. She sat periodically revving the engine and honking, while the other driver had gone inside to shop. 47 minutes into her vigil, the engine temperature gauge began climbing into the red zone. The relentless idling and triple-digit heat, combined with prolonged air conditioning use, pushed the cooling system beyond its limits. As temperatures climbed, the vehicle automatically shut off the air conditioning compressor to protect the engine. Minutes later, the overheating forced the engine to stall. With the engine silent, radiant heat from the sun and asphalt quickly overwhelmed the cabin. Brella remained seated, her phone now recording a video as she documented her complaint. Her face grew increasingly flushed as sweat soaked through her velour tracksuit. A teenage employee collecting carts noticed her vehicle still parked in the lane 15 minutes later. He saw her through the windshield, gesturing at her phone, her face noticeably red. 5 minutes later, a couple observed her slumped slightly to one side. The woman suggested checking on her, but her husband noted the door was open. As time passed after the engine failure, another shopper noticed her hands had stopped moving and her condition appeared to be worsening. 28 minutes after the engine failed, she collapsed forward against the steering wheel. The sustained horn blast drew a crowd. They found her unresponsive, her skin flushed and overheated. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. They found her pulseless and in cardiac arrest. Despite immediate cooling measures and advanced life support, her body showed no response. She was pronounced dead at 3:52 that afternoon. The medical examiner determined the cause as severe heat stroke with multiple organ failure. The other driver provided security footage to authorities. The evidence showed Brella had chosen to remain in the vehicle even after the engine failed. No charges were filed. Investigators recovered Brella's phone from the vehicle. It contained a 22-minute video she had recorded, the footage showing her becoming progressively more flushed and disoriented before the phone dropped. The audio captured her final labored breathing. Her family requested the footage never be released publicly. It was March 22, 2018, at a roadside checkpoint outside Phoenix. Cars moved forward in a slow, controlled line, each one stopping briefly before being waved through. Headlights stretched down the road, engines idling, everything moving at a steady pace. Felicia Luray was 44 and driving alone that night. She worked in insurance claims and was used to pushing until she got the outcome she wanted. That didn't stop when she left work. If something didn't go the way she expected, she didn't just let it pass. She challenged it, and if that didn't work, she pushed it further. Waiting wasn't something she handled well, and being told to move along without getting her point across bothered her. If she felt like something should be handled differently, she treated it like it was her place to say so. When she reached the checkpoint, the stop started the way it always does. She slowed down and pulled forward when directed, but instead of letting it stay simple, she shifted it. She started bringing up her driving record, like it needed to be checked or recognized right there. It wasn't part of what was happening, but she kept it going anyway, like it should matter in that moment. That's where things slowed down. Instead of finishing the stop and moving on, she held her position longer than necessary. The officer stepped away briefly toward a nearby vehicle, leaving her waiting in place while the line behind her started to back up. That pause stretched longer than it needed to. She remained in her vehicle at first, but her attention shifted away from the checkpoint itself. The process had already been interrupted, and instead of settling back into it, she stayed keyed in, watching, waiting, looking for something else to focus on. That's when the barking started. Behind her, secured in the rear section of that nearby vehicle, a service dog began barking. It was steady and loud, carrying clearly in the otherwise quiet stretch of road. At first, it was just background noise, but she didn't ignore it. She turned her attention toward it, watching it through the rear of the vehicle. The barking didn't stop, and instead of focusing on her own situation, she fixated on it. To her, it became part of the problem, something she shouldn't have to deal with while she was being held there. The longer it went on, the more it held her attention. She shifted in her seat, then leaned slightly to get a better view. The dog remained secured, moving within its confined space, reacting to the environment around it. The barking stayed consistent. That was enough. She opened her door and stepped out. Instead of staying where she was, she moved a few steps toward the rear of the nearby vehicle, close enough now that the sound was louder, more direct. She had a plastic water bottle in her hand. Instead of stepping back or leaving it alone, she made a decision to deal with it herself. She threw the bottle toward the dog. It wasn't forceful, but it didn't need to be. It was enough to trigger a reaction. The dog lunged forward against its restraint immediately. The movement was sudden and sharp, accompanied by a louder burst of barking. That's when she reacted. She stepped backward quickly, trying to create distance. She was already close to the edge of the lane, and behind her was a raised concrete curb. Her heel caught it. The backward motion didn't stop. With her weight already shifting, there was no time to recover. She lost balance and fell straight back. The back of her head struck the edge of the curb. It happened in a single motion. Throw, lunge, step back, fall. People nearby saw the entire sequence clearly. There was no contact between her and the dog at any point. The restraint held, and the distance remained. She did not get up. After stepping away, personnel at the checkpoint returned to the lane and found her lying unresponsive near the curb. The area showed no signs of additional movement or secondary impact. The position of her body and the injury were consistent with a direct backward fall onto the curb. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. The officer and checkpoint personnel were cleared entirely. She had exited her vehicle without instruction and moved toward a secured area on her own. The service dog was evaluated by its handler and cleared for continued duty. No action was taken against the animal. It was formally closed as an accidental death. It was August 3rd, 2018, at a multiplex movie theater in San Diego, California. The evening showing of a popular action film had drawn a packed audience to the largest theater in the complex. Margaret Donovan was 44 years old and worked as a substitute teacher, a position that had given her strong opinions about proper behavior and respect for rules. She considered herself a serious film enthusiast and believed that other moviegoers often ruined the cinematic experience through inappropriate conduct. Theater employees knew her as someone who frequently complained about other patrons and demanded refunds for minor inconveniences. Margaret had developed her own system for monitoring theater behavior. She would arrive early to select the optimal seat for both viewing and surveillance, then spend the previews identifying potential troublemakers. Her purse contained a small notebook where she recorded violations of what she considered proper theater etiquette. That evening, Margaret had chosen a center seat in the middle section, providing clear sight lines to most of the audience. During the previews, she noticed a family with young children sitting 3 rows behind her. When the children began whispering during the opening credits, Margaret turned around and loudly shushed them, drawing attention from nearby moviegoers. The family's father politely asked his children to be quieter, but Margaret continued monitoring their behavior throughout the first act. She quietly took notes about what she considered disruptive patrons, planning to file a complaint with theater management after the show. As the film progressed, Margaret identified several other violations of her theater standards. She stood up repeatedly to confront different audience members about talking, eating too loudly, or checking their phones. Each time she moved, she would relocate to different seats to better monitor various sections of the theater, creating additional disturbances. During the film's climactic scene, the family's youngest child asked a question about the plot. Margaret immediately stood up and announced loudly that inconsiderate people like them were ruining the movie for everyone else. She declared that she was leaving to find a theater that actually enforced proper behavior standards and began climbing the steep theater steps in the dim light. Margaret was so focused on making her dramatic exit and continuing her confrontational behavior that she wasn't paying attention to where she was going. She pulled out her phone to illuminate her path, visibly agitated as she moved toward the exit. The theater's side exit was located at the top of the aisle, leading to a maintenance stairwell that connected to the lobby. The door was marked with standard exit signage, but also displayed a small, staff-only notice that patrons were not meant to use. Margaret had been focused on her indignant departure rather than the theater's layout, and the exit door was positioned where a public lobby entrance would typically be located from her seating position. Margaret reached what she believed was the door to the lobby and pushed through without checking where it led. Instead of entering a hallway, she stepped directly into a steep maintenance stairwell with concrete steps leading down to the building's lower level. The stairwell was dimly lit, and the handrails were positioned farther down the steps, out of immediate reach from the entrance. She immediately lost her footing on the steep concrete steps and tumbled down the entire flight, striking her head multiple times against the concrete walls. Her phone flew from her hand and shattered on the steps below. A theater employee heard the commotion and rushed to investigate. Margaret was found unconscious at the bottom of the stairwell with severe head trauma and multiple broken bones. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but she had sustained fatal injuries from the fall. She died from massive internal trauma before reaching the hospital. The movie was stopped temporarily while theater staff secured the maintenance area and contacted management. Additional warning signs were installed near all staff exits, and the theater implemented new policies requiring better lighting in maintenance areas. The investigation ruled Margaret's death accidental due to unauthorized use of staff-only exits. It was September 14, 2019 in Plano, Texas. The afternoon temperature had reached 85 degrees as parents gathered at the community park for the Under-12 Soccer League championship game between two local teams. Michelle Torres was 38 years old and worked in corporate HR, spending her days filing complaints about workplace policies and investigating employee grievances. She had developed a reputation among the soccer parents for confronting coaches and referees about what she perceived as unfair treatment of her son, who typically spent most games on the bench. The game was in the second half when Michelle's son received a yellow card for a rough tackle that sent an opposing player to the ground. Michelle immediately abandoned her lawn chair and stormed onto the field, disrupting active play. She marched directly toward the referee, gesturing angrily about the unfairness of the call. The referee blew his whistle to stop play as Michelle began making loud accusations about biased officiating and favoritism toward the opposing team. Michelle demanded that the yellow card be reversed and threatened to report the referee to league officials. Other parents began shouting for her to leave the field as coaches from both teams stepped in to block her path and calm the situation. She refused to comply and continued shouting accusations about biased officiating and discrimination against her son. The referee attempted to restart play. Michelle positioned herself directly in front of him, preventing the game from continuing. A league official arrived and instructed her to return to the sidelines immediately. Instead, Michelle escalated further, accusing the league of corruption and threatening lawsuits while gesturing aggressively in the heat. Several parents began recording as her behavior drew the attention of spectators across the field. After several minutes, two coaches escorted her off the field toward the parking lot. She continued shouting as she walked, repeatedly turning back toward the field and pointing at the officials while arguing with staff members. Once in the parking area, Michelle broke away from the staff and continued yelling toward the field, pacing between rows of parked cars as traffic moved through the crowded lot. Several parents later said she ignored repeated warnings to step out of the driving lane. Still shouting and pointing back toward the field, Michelle walked directly into an active traffic lane without checking for vehicles. A sport utility vehicle had already begun reversing out of a nearby parking space. The driver had no opportunity to stop before Michelle stepped directly behind the moving vehicle. The rear bumper struck her and knocked her to the pavement. As she fell, one of the rear tires rolled over her upper torso. Bystanders screamed as the driver immediately braked and exited the vehicle. Michelle lay unresponsive on the asphalt as several parents rushed forward and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be fatal crush injuries to the chest and abdomen with massive internal bleeding. Surveillance footage and witness statements confirmed that Michelle had walked into the driving lane while distracted and that the vehicle had been moving at low speed. Investigators ruled the death accidental. The driver was not charged. The championship game was canceled and the field was cleared as parents led the young players away from the scene. The case was formally closed several weeks later. It was October 22, 2017, during a North Atlantic crossing where the weather had already turned before most passengers fully understood how serious it was. The sky stayed overcast, wind moved steadily across the decks, and the ship carried a noticeable roll as waves pushed against its side. Crew announcements made it clear that exterior decks were closed due to unsafe conditions. From inside, it didn't look extreme, just rough water and wind. But out there was no shelter, no stability, just exposure. That's where Mina Triss comes in. She was 36, worked in sales, and had built a habit of documenting everything. Much of her trip had been spent recording and reacting, framing moments for attention, strong opinions, quick takes, visible pushback. The camera wasn't just recording what she saw, it was shaping how she responded. When the restrictions were announced, she didn't take them seriously. Crew had placed barriers across access points with clear signage and repeated instructions to remain indoors. But Mina moved one aside. A crew member intercepted her, telling her the deck was closed and unsafe. The exchange didn't stay calm. Mina pushed back, insisting the conditions weren't that bad while continuing to film, her tone aimed at proving something. The crew member repeated the instruction, but with other areas to monitor, he eventually stepped away. Once the staff were gone, there was nothing left to challenge her. Stopping then would have meant ending the clip without payoff. No proof, no moment. So she doubled down. Sometimes people don't ignore warnings because they think they're wrong. They ignore them because they've already committed to a version of events they feel they have to deliver. And once you're in that headspace, every step forward feels like conviction instead of escalation. The moment she stepped outside, the environment changed completely. Wind pushed across the deck in bursts, the surface was wet, and the ship shifted with each wave. Mina walked several feet out, holding her phone toward the ocean. A gust hit from the side, forcing her off balance and dropping her to the deck. She stood back up. I want to stop here for a second because that fall mattered. It was the environment telling her exactly what it was capable of, plainly and without ambiguity. Most people would have heard it. Mina reframed it. Getting back up wasn't a near miss. It was footage. She raised her phone, stepped onto the lower rail support, and leaned forward against the top railing to stabilize herself while filming. Sudden wind came in intervals, each one shifting her stance slightly. And here's the thing about small adjustments in unstable conditions. They compound. Each one feels manageable on its own. Together, they close off your options without you noticing. Then, the ship rolled. Not dramatically, but enough to shift her balance as another gust hit at the same time. She grabbed the top rail, staying upright instead of stepping back. Another gust followed, stronger than before. Her body lifted slightly and tipped over the railing line. Her grip broke, and she went over. The phone stayed behind, propped at an angle against the base of the railing. Still recording, pointed outward at nothing but open water and gray sky. Wind moved across the microphone in long, unbroken rushes. No voices, no impact, just weather filling the frame where she had been standing moments before. That footage is the last record of her. Her family was notified 2 days later. Her mother said she hadn't known about the account, hadn't known about most of it. She said Mina had seemed happy the last time they spoke, just before the trip. They'd talked about getting together at Christmas. It was a weekday morning in the spring of 2016 in a residential neighborhood in Sacramento, California. The narrow two-lane street had a noticeable downhill grade, with posted signs reminding drivers to turn their wheels into the curb when parking. Deborah Koslow was 54 years old and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small family-owned business. She kept a consistent daily routine, running errands in the same general area most weekday mornings before going in for her afternoon shift. She had driven the same routes through that neighborhood for years and was familiar with nearly every block. People who knew her described her as someone who treated every minor dispute as a matter of principle rather than convenience, and who did not respond well to being corrected by anyone she considered to be in a position of minor authority. She had contested parking citations on at least 4 separate occasions in the 2 years prior. On one occasion, she had followed a meter maid to their next stop on the same street to continue an argument that had already been resolved against her. She was known among neighbors for sending group emails about parking violations on their block and had once demanded written justification from a parking enforcement officer for a citation she had received years earlier. On the morning of the incident, Deborah parked her 1998 Honda Accord on the downhill side of the street, which had an approximately 8% grade, to drop off a document at a neighbor's house. She left the car in park but did not turn the front wheels into the curb, violating posted parking rules, a habit she had maintained for years. A meter maid was already writing a citation when she returned minutes later. Deborah approached immediately and began contesting the citation on the spot. The meter maid pointed to the posted sign and indicated the wheels were not turned into the curb. Deborah disagreed and stated she had parked on that street many times without issue. The exchange continued for several minutes without resolution. Neither party moved from the spot. As the conversation continued, Deborah reached back into the open driver's side door and leaned across toward the passenger seat where the folder was sitting. While leaning across the seat, her weight shifted onto the door frame and seat edge. Investigators determined the transmission had not been fully engaged in park when she exited the vehicle, leaving the parking mechanism only partially seated. The shift in her weight altered the load on the drivetrain, allowing the partially engaged parking mechanism to slip free. The car began rolling backward down the grade. Deborah was still partially inside the doorframe when the vehicle started moving. Her body weight was distributed between the doorframe and the seat, which made it difficult to push herself clear quickly. The meter maid's vehicle was parked about 15 feet behind Deborah's car. On the 8% grade, the rollback covered that distance in roughly 3 to 4 seconds. Deborah was still partially inside the doorframe and could not pull clear before her rear bumper struck the front of the meter maid's vehicle, pinning her at the hip and lower torso and causing fatal internal injuries. The meter maid was standing approximately 6 feet to the side at the moment the car began moving and witnessed the entire sequence from start to finish. 2 residents on the sidewalk across the street also observed the rollback and collision. All 3 accounts were consistent on every key detail. Deborah was pronounced dead at the scene. The transmission was found disengaged from park, and the folder she had been reaching for was open on the passenger seat. The front wheels were still pointing straight, consistent with witness accounts. The death was ruled accidental, and the case was closed without further action. It was March 3, 2017, in Dayton, Ohio. A layer of gray cloud cover hung low over a commercial strip where a small independent coffee shop occupied the corner of a brick storefront. The sidewalks were damp from overnight rain, reflecting muted traffic lights at the intersection. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off freshly mopped white tile floors. A waist-high swinging gate separated the customer area from the narrow workspace behind the counter. The hum of refrigeration units blended with the hiss of pressurized steam from the espresso machine. Liddy Spoff, 41, worked part-time at a dental office, managing front desk duties. Outside of work, she maintained an active social media presence, documenting what she described as poor customer service. Over several years, she posted detailed complaints about minor inconveniences, often including photos and demands for refunds. Those familiar with her described a pattern. When told something could not be done, she often tried to prove it could. That morning, she ordered a latte and instructed the barista to make it exactly boiling. The 19-year-old employee explained that milk is typically steamed to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit to preserve texture and prevent scalding. Commercial espresso machines generate steam above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, but it is controlled before contacting milk. Heating milk to boiling, 212 degrees Fahrenheit at standard pressure, would ruin its structure and create safety risks. Liddy insisted the machine was capable of higher heat and accused the barista of not knowing how to operate it properly. As the explanation continued, Liddy stepped closer to the counter. Without permission, she unlatched the waist-high gate and entered the employee-only area. The barista, startled, startled, backed toward the register and told her to step away from the equipment. Two customers waiting in line moved toward the exit. The espresso machine had just completed a shot extraction. The portafilter remained locked into the group head, where water had been forced through compacted coffee grounds at roughly 9 bars of pressure. The boiler maintained steam pressure slightly above 1 bar for milk frothing. Liddy grabbed the portafilter handle and tried to twist it free. Because pressure inside the group head had not fully dissipated, the seal resisted briefly before releasing abruptly. When the portafilter disengaged, a burst of superheated water and steam expelled outward from the group head. The liquid temperature exceeded 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The spray struck the left side of her face and neck at close range. At the same time, her reflex caused her elbow to hit the steam wand control, opening it further. A second plume of steam vented across her upper chest. She recoiled, losing footing on the damp tile. Her heel slid against the smooth surface. She fell backward, striking her shoulder against a wall-mounted shelving bracket. The metal support bent, dislodging ceramic mugs that shattered across the floor. The barista shut off the steam valve and hit the emergency cutoff switch within seconds. Another employee called 911. The entire sequence, from entry behind the counter to shutdown, lasted less than 30 seconds. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes. Liddy was conscious, but in severe distress. Paramedics documented deep partial thickness and full thickness burns to her face, neck, and upper chest. Burn specialists estimated the injuries covered about 18% of her total body surface area, with critical airway involvement from steam inhalation. Swelling progressed rapidly, despite intubation and aggressive fluid resuscitation at the regional burn center 12 miles away. She developed respiratory failure and burn-related shock later that evening and was pronounced deceased. A subsequent investigation reviewed surveillance footage and inspected the equipment. The espresso machine's pressure gauges and safety valves were operating within manufacturer specifications. Commercial machines include pressure relief systems, but they cannot prevent injury if a pressurized portafilter is removed too early. Investigators concluded the incident resulted from unauthorized interference with functioning equipment. The shop was not cited for violations, but installed a self-closing, lockable gate and added warning signage. The barista received counseling and later transferred locations. It was November 15, 2015, at the King of Prussia Mall in Pennsylvania. A main escalator between the first and second floors had been shut down since morning due to a mechanical failure in the step drive system, with interlocking safety barricades and warning signs positioned across both entrances to block access for shoppers. Maintenance crews were operating the escalator in inspection mode when a diagnostic condition left the step drive stopped while the handrail moved briefly during testing, a rare mismatch investigators later described as a temporary safety hazard. A security guard directed shoppers toward the elevator and side staircase as maintenance personnel worked nearby. Lindley Priff, a 39-year-old lifestyle blogger, entered the mall wearing 4-inch stiletto heels and carrying 6 shopping bags from various stores. Security later noted she appeared unsteady on her feet, and toxicology would later confirm alcohol in her system. She continued filming content for her social media accounts as she moved through the mall, documenting luxury shopping experiences. Her afternoon had been dedicated to filming herself in different locations throughout the mall for her online followers. The broken escalator presented an obstacle to her planned route. The metal steps sat motionless while the rubber handrail continued its upward movement, creating a dangerous mismatch that maintenance crews were attempting to repair. The security guard was directing foot traffic away from the hazardous equipment when Lindley approached, demanding to know why she couldn't use the escalator. When informed that the escalator was experiencing a partial mechanical failure and was potentially dangerous, Lindley became agitated. She complained that her high heels made the regular stairs difficult and that waiting for elevators was inconvenient. The guard explained the safety concerns and pointed toward alternative routes, but Lindley dismissed these warnings as unnecessary restrictions. The guard momentarily turned her attention to assist an elderly customer who needed directions. During this brief window, Lindley ducked under the caution tape and stepped onto the motionless escalator. Her stiletto heels immediately made contact with the metal step edges, which provided no stability for narrow heel points. She lost her balance within seconds Instinctively, she reached for the rubber handrail, which was still moving upward despite the steps being stationary. This created a pulling force that dragged her forward while her feet remained planted, causing her body to twist unnaturally. Her right stiletto heel caught against the edge of a step cleat as the moving handrail continued pulling her upper body forward. The heel snapped off completely while her ankle twisted violently. She fell face first down the motionless steps, her shopping bag scattering as she tumbled. The metal edges of each step struck her head and body as she fell approximately 20 feet down the escalator. Her momentum carried her to the bottom, where her head struck the metal comb plate, resulting in severe cranial trauma later confirmed by the medical examiner. Shoppers in the area immediately began screaming and calling for help. The security guard ran over and found Lindley unconscious with severe head trauma, blood flowing from her ears and nose. She called emergency services while attempting to provide basic first aid. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes and found Lindley unresponsive with no spontaneous respiration and fixed, dilated pupils. She was transported to the hospital but was pronounced dead at 3:45 p.m. from multiple skull fractures and traumatic brain injury. The medical examiner determined that the combination of falling down the metal steps and the final impact with the comb plate had caused unsurvivable damage. Mall security footage clearly showed Lindley had deliberately bypassed all safety barriers and warnings. The escalator had been properly marked as out of service due to the dangerous partial mechanical failure. The mall's insurance company determined she was entirely at fault for ignoring safety measures. Investigators recovered Lindley's phone from the scene, which had been recording when she bypassed the safety barriers. The recording documented her bypassing the posted safety barriers moments before stepping onto the disabled escalator. At her family's request, this footage was never released to the public. It was August 14, 2017, at a coastal marina along the Gulf. The docks were calm that afternoon, boats sitting steady, lines tied clean, water barely moving. It looked routine, the kind of setup that only works because everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. Her name was Colleen Kessler, 52, and she had rented a slip for the weekend. She worked in office administration and was known for being controlling about details. Everything had to match her standards or she treated it like a problem. That didn't stay at work. She had a habit of inserting herself into situations that didn't involve her, especially if something looked wrong in her eyes. She didn't ask questions, didn't double-check, didn't wait. She assumed she understood what she was looking at and acted on it. If someone pushed back, she tended to double down rather than reconsider. To her, being confident felt the same as being correct. That weekend, she kept coming back to one specific line tied along the dock a short distance from her slip. It ran from a cleat down into the water, at a tight angle, with no visible boat attached. To anyone familiar with the layout, it was clearly part of a fixed navigation marker system, something placed to guide boats safely out of a shallow section near the marina exit, but she didn't see it that way. What she saw was a mistake, a loose line, something set up poorly, something drifting too close to her space. So she decided to fix it. The first time, she untied it and pulled it over a bit, retightening it where she thought it made more sense. It gave her more room, at least visually. Nothing reacted. No one stopped her. That was enough confirmation for her. Later, she came back and adjusted it again, then again, the next morning. Each change was small, just inches at a time. But that line wasn't meant to be adjusted at all. It was connected to a weighted anchor holding a navigation marker in a precise position underwater. Moving the line changed the marker's placement, and that placement mattered. It marked the safe path between deeper water and a rock shelf that sat just below the surface near the exit. By the time she was ready to leave, the marker had been pulled off its intended line enough to misrepresent the safe route. She untied her own boat and stepped aboard, moving out at a slow, controlled speed. From her perspective, everything looked fine. The water was calm, visibility clear. She lined up her exit based on what she could see, the dock, the spacing, the marker's position. But that marker was no longer where it should have been. As she moved forward, her boat tracked slightly off the safe channel and toward the shallow rock shelf. There was no warning, no visible sign from above. The hull, struck hard against the submerged rock, the impact running along the underside. It tore open a section near the front, and water began rushing in immediately. Within seconds, the front dipped. The boat lost balance fast. The stern lifted slightly as water filled the hull, and the entire vessel began to sink. People nearby saw it happen. The shift was sudden. The angle, the drop, the speed of it. There wasn't time to react or correct course. The boat went under in under 3 minutes. People nearby saw the angle change, watched the bow drop and the stern lift, and understood quickly that it wasn't going to correct. But by the time anyone moved toward the water, it was already too late. The impact had thrown Colleen forward into the console. She was likely disoriented or briefly unconscious from the strike. Witnesses said she didn't call out, didn't appear in the water, didn't surface. She went down with the boat. The navigation marker had been displaced. The anchor line she had repeatedly adjusted over the weekend had shifted the marker enough to mislead her own exit path. It wasn't a large movement, but it didn't need to be. The safe channel was narrow, and even a small change in reference could push a boat into shallow water. The case was ruled accidental. The marina was not found liable. The marker system had been correctly installed and documented, with no way to anticipate tampering between arrival and departure. The marker was repositioned afterward, and a second fixed buoy was added near the shelf as a precaution. It was July 19, 2016, at a public park in Charlotte, North Carolina. By early afternoon, temperatures had reached 98 degrees Fahrenheit, with heavy humidity trapping heat close to the ground. Shade was limited along the open walking paths, and the concrete surfaces had been absorbing direct sunlight since mid-morning. Sandra Kellerman was 39 years old and spent much of her free time walking through the city's parks for exercise. Over time, she had developed firm views about environmental conservation, particularly regarding water usage. She believed most irrigation practices weaken plants by making them dependent on human intervention. Park maintenance workers recognized her as a frequent critic of watering schedules, often encountering her complaints during routine upkeep. Sandra's philosophy centered on self-sufficiency. She believed grass should survive on natural rainfall alone, even during extreme heat. To her, brown or patchy lawns were signs of resilience, not neglect. She applied these beliefs rigidly, rejecting explanations that contradicted her views. While completing her walk that afternoon, Sandra noticed the park's sprinkler system running across a large, grassy area. Water arced through the air as the system cycled, soaking the ground, while the surrounding concrete radiated heat. The sight immediately drew her attention. She approached a maintenance worker adjusting the sprinkler heads nearby and began criticizing the watering schedule, insisting the grass was being weakened by unnecessary irrigation. The worker explained that the schedule was intended to prevent turf damage during heat waves. Sandra dismissed the explanation and continued lecturing about environmental responsibility. When the worker resumed his task, she announced that she would demonstrate proper conservation principles herself. Sandra positioned her body directly beside one of the active sprinkler heads, partially blocking the spray. The system continued cycling, soaking her clothing intermittently but failing to cool her core. Wet fabric clung to her skin while the concrete beneath her continued radiating heat upward. She declared the discomfort a necessary sacrifice for education. Several park visitors approached and suggested she move to a shaded area. Others offered bottled water. Sandra refused all assistance. She insisted that enduring the heat proved her point and accused onlookers of contributing to environmental waste. She then sat down on the exposed concrete path beside the sprinkler, choosing to remain in direct sunlight. Over time, the combination of radiant heat, humidity, and trapped moisture began overwhelming her body's ability to regulate temperature. She remained seated without shade or hydration, continuing to speak loudly about water conservation. As minutes passed, her speech became repetitive and disorganized. Visitors noticed she appeared confused and struggled to respond coherently. Despite repeated encouragement to move, Sandra refused. Nearly 2 hours passed as she remained in place, her body temperature rising steadily. Eventually, she slumped forward and lost consciousness on the concrete. Emergency responders arrived and found Sandra unresponsive, with signs of severe heat stroke. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where doctors worked to reduce her core temperature and stabilize her condition. Despite medical intervention, she suffered extensive internal complications caused by prolonged hyperthermia. Sandra died later that evening from complications of severe heat stroke, resulting from voluntary exposure to extreme heat and refusal of hydration and shade. Authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed that Sandra had declined assistance multiple times and ignored warnings from both park staff and bystanders. The death was ruled accidental, attributed to voluntary refusal to leave dangerous environmental conditions. In the months that followed, the park installed additional shade structures and water stations and posted heat safety warnings throughout the grounds. It was November 8, 2015, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, when a large retail store filled with evening shoppers taking advantage of weekday sales. Customer service lines stretched toward the entrance as employees processed returns, exchanges, and price adjustments under bright fluorescent lighting. Carol Turner, 47, arrived at the store shortly after leaving work. She managed the downtown branch of a regional bank where she had spent more than a decade overseeing customer disputes and enforcing compliance policies. Co-workers later described her as meticulous and confrontational, known for documenting minor procedural mistakes and escalating small issues into formal complaints. In her neighborhood and workplace, she developed a reputation for inserting herself into conflicts and pursuing grievances until supervisors or management personally addressed her concerns. Carol had brought with her a decorative lamp she had purchased 3 weeks earlier and now wanted to return. At the customer service counter, she was assisted by a 19-year-old part-time employee assigned to handle evening returns. Store records later identified him as a college student working his first retail job. He examined the lamp and requested her receipt, explaining that returns older than 2 weeks required proof of purchase under store policy. Carol immediately objected, stating that longtime customers should not be required to present receipts. When the employee explained that the system could not locate transactions without documentation, she insisted that the policy be ignored and the return processed manually. As the line behind her grew, the employee offered to contact a supervisor for approval. Carol refused to wait. Witnesses later stated that her voice rose as she accused the employee of incompetence and deliberate obstruction. When he attempted to step away toward the manager's office, she followed. The employee moved quickly through a swinging door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and entered the stockroom area. Carol ignored the warning sign and pushed through the door behind him. Inside the stockroom, narrow aisles ran between tall shelving racks stacked with boxed electronics and small appliances awaiting inventory. Surveillance footage later showed Carol following the employee down the aisle, continuing to gesture and block his path as he tried to move toward the back office. Near the end of the aisle, Carol stopped beside a tall mobile shelving rack and leaned her body against the metal frame as she continued confronting him. The shelving unit stood more than 8 feet high and had been designed to remain movable during stocking operations. It was not anchored to the floor and relied on weight distribution to remain balanced. As Carol pressed her weight forward, the top-heavy rack began to shift. The employee stepped away when he noticed the movement. Carol continued leaning against the frame, unaware that the rack's center of gravity had already moved past its balance point. Seconds later, the shelving tipped forward. The metal structure and dozens of heavy boxes collapsed onto Carol, pinning her to the concrete floor beneath the full weight of the rack and its contents. Store employees rushed into the aisle and attempted to lift the shelving, but the load was too heavy to move by hand. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and used hydraulic lifting equipment to free her from beneath the rack. Carol was barely conscious when she was removed, breathing shallowly and showing signs of severe chest compression. Paramedics provided oxygen and intravenous fluids and transported her to a nearby trauma center for emergency treatment. Doctors later determined that she had suffered extensive internal injuries, including lung contusions and internal bleeding caused by prolonged compression of her chest and abdomen. Despite emergency surgery and intensive care, her condition continued to deteriorate. She died later that night from complications related to crush asphyxia and internal hemorrhage. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death traumatic crush asphyxia with delayed respiratory failure following thoracic compression. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, defensive injuries, or pre-existing medical conditions. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage and employee statements, confirming that Carol had entered a restricted stockroom area and leaned her body weight against the unanchored shelving immediately before it tipped. A safety inspection found no mechanical defects or load violations. Her death was ruled accidental. No criminal charges were filed. The case was closed 3 weeks later. It was May 11th, 2018, along an Alaska cruise route, where the air carried a cold edge even during the day, and the ship eased toward a dock surrounded by dark water and steel structures. As the vessel prepared to berth, the open deck shifted from a viewing space into a working one. Crew moved with purpose, sections were clearly marked off, and the tone turned controlled. If you were standing there, you'd notice that shift immediately. Painted lines marked boundaries across the deck. Signs warned about moving equipment and high-tension lines, while crew directed passengers to stay back, repeating instructions as operations began. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a working zone, designed to keep distance between people and machinery. Angela Cragg was 39, working in a logistics-related role, and from what was later gathered, she relied heavily on her own judgment in operational settings. Not reckless, methodical. The kind of person who believes that if something is understandable, it's manageable. That risk isn't eliminated by distance, but by awareness. She was traveling with family and moved toward the outer deck to watch docking more closely. Her husband noticed immediately. He had experience working at sea, the kind that lets you recognize danger before it looks dangerous. He stopped her near the boundary, explaining how the winches worked and why the area wasn't just restricted, it was hazardous. He explained it the way you would to someone you don't want to lose. She listened, but not in the way he needed her to. She followed what he said, even nodded at parts of it, but the shift happened quietly. Not dismissal, interpretation. She wasn't rejecting the risk, she was reframing it. Position and awareness. She believed those were enough. That danger came from carelessness, not proximity. He told her no, firmly. Stay behind the line. She didn't argue, just gave a small acknowledgement, the kind that ends a conversation without agreeing. For a moment, she stepped back, enough to make it look settled. Then their daughter needed attention in the room. Her husband hesitated, looked at her once more, and left. The second he was gone, she moved forward again, not to break a rule, but because she believed she understood the system well enough to stand closer to it. Mooring operations were already underway. Thick lines stretched from ship to dock under heavy tension, controlled by powered winches feeding onto rotating drums. Angela positioned herself within a few feet of the machinery, inside an area already marked off limits. What stands out is how normal everything looked. The motion is steady, controlled, almost slow, and that's exactly what makes it easy to misjudge. She had already decided the system was predictable, and that predictability meant safety. The sequence is clear. The winch engaged, pulling the line under load as the drum rotated steadily. The tension in that system was far beyond what a person could resist. Angela remained within range. At some point, a loose section of her clothing made contact with the moving mooring line just before it fed into the drum. From there, there's no delay. The line tightened, dragged the fabric forward, and as it wrapped onto the drum, it pulled her in, her arm following before she could react. Crew rushed to initiate the emergency stop, but the system didn't halt instantly. The drum continued briefly under load. That short delay was enough. By the time it stopped, she had sustained critical crushing injuries. The coroner's final report listed the cause as fatal entanglement and crushing injuries after breaching a designated mooring hazard area. Angela Cragg didn't ignore something she didn't understand. She trusted that understanding too much. It was the evening of January 14, 2015, in a remote area of northern Wisconsin. January temperatures in the region often fall into the single digits. The cabin sat miles from the nearest town, connected by unlit two-lane highways and narrow private roads cutting through dense forest. Marlene was 61 years old and had been retired for 3 years after a long career as a school librarian. She spent her winters splitting time between her apartment and a shared family cabin in the northern part of the state. She rarely drove in winter conditions and relied on other family members for most of the logistics during cabin trips. Within the family, she had a reputation for dominating group decisions and responding poorly when challenged. On previous visits, she had reorganized sleeping arrangements, kitchen storage, and common areas without asking, then treated objections as ingratitude. She had stopped speaking to a sibling for several months over a disagreement about shared furniture. People close to her described a pattern where she reframed losing an argument as choosing to disengage. She did not back down, and she did not turn back. On the second evening of the trip, a disagreement developed over sleeping arrangements that had been informally agreed upon before anyone arrived. The dispute involved Marlene and at least 2 of the 3 relatives present. It escalated over the course of about an hour. At one point, a relative told her directly that it was too cold to be outside without proper clothing and that she should calm down before doing something she couldn't take back. Marlene told him she didn't need to be managed. A few minutes later, another relative handed her coat to her and suggested she at least put it on. She pushed it back. She said she wasn't going anywhere, then walked out the door without it. The temperature that evening was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind brought the effective temperature down to approximately -6 degrees Fahrenheit. The relatives assumed she had gone to sit in one of the two cars parked outside, which would have been the reasonable thing to do. No one went out immediately to check. When one relative did go out several minutes later, both cars were empty, and the exterior light showed her footprints in the packed snow leading away from the vehicles and down the cabin road toward the highway. The relatives went back inside for their coats and keys before driving out to look, which added more time before any active search began. By then, she had already reached the highway. Marlene had walked the full length of the cabin road and turned onto the highway shoulder. Investigators later reconstructed her path from physical evidence. Her footprints tracked along the shoulder for approximately a third of a mile before veering from the packed surface into the looser drifted snow at the road's edge. The snow on the embankment showed a clear disturbance where she had descended the slope, disrupted crust, compressed drift, and a drag pattern consistent with someone lowering themselves to sit. She came to rest at the base of a guardrail post on the embankment below road level and out of sight from passing vehicles. She had no coat, no gloves, no hat, and was wearing the indoor shoes she had on during the argument. At 9 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, exposed skin begins losing heat rapidly within minutes. She was found the following morning by a driver who had pulled over on the shoulder to check a loose item in the bed of his truck. He noticed her slumped against the guardrail post on the embankment below road level. She was unresponsive. She was approximately 0.4 miles from the cabin turnoff. The relatives confirmed the timeline, the warnings given, and the time she left. Their accounts matched the physical evidence, including her footprint trail and the disturbed snow on the embankment. The coat she refused was later found draped over a chair inside the cabin. Marlene was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be environmental exposure. The manner was ruled accidental. No other parties were found to have contributed to the circumstances of her death. The case was closed without further action against any individual. It was June 18, 2017, in Plano, Texas, where the morning sun reflected off the crystal clear water of the community swimming pool. The temperature was climbing toward 85 degrees with high humidity, creating perfect conditions for swimmers seeking relief from the Texas heat. The pool area was quiet at 11:30 a.m., with only a few early swimmers enjoying the calm before the afternoon rush. Candace Gloat, a 52-year-old woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales, arrived carrying a small testing kit she had purchased online. She had spent the previous 3 weeks filing complaints with the Homeowners Association about water quality. Despite the pool passing all required health inspections, Candace had convinced herself that the chemical levels were dangerously inadequate. The pool maintenance worker, a certified technician with 8 years of experience, was performing his routine morning chemical balancing when Candace approached. She immediately began testing the water with cheap test strips, announcing loudly that the chlorine levels were too low and unsafe. The worker explained that he had just added the proper chemicals, but Candace dismissed his expertise entirely. She pulled out her phone and began recording, claiming the worker was ignoring unsafe chemical levels, demanding that more chemicals be added immediately. The worker tried to explain the dangers of improper chemical mixing, but Candace had already decided she knew better. The maintenance cart sat nearby outside the equipment room, its door temporarily propped open while the technician balanced chemicals. Inside were a 50-pound bucket of calcium hypochlorite granules and a plastic jug of muriatic acid. The chemicals were intended to be stored and handled separately. Investigators later noted that combining them created a rapid chlorine gas release. Candace grabbed the heavy bucket, declaring her intention to fix the problem herself. The worker immediately shouted warnings, but she had already pushed past him into the small equipment room where the pool's filtration system hummed. The room was only 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single ventilation fan. She set the bucket down and noticed the jug of muriatic acid on the shelf. Investigators later recovered recent phone searches related to pool pH balancing, suggesting she believed the water required both chlorine and acid adjustment at the same time. The worker frantically tried to stop her, but Candace ignored him completely. She poured several cups of muriatic acid directly into the bucket of calcium hypochlorite granules. The reaction was immediate. The mixture began to hiss and heat rapidly, releasing a harsh, yellow-green chlorine vapor that filled the small enclosed room within seconds. Candace gasped reflexively in surprise, pulling the chlorine vapor deep into her lungs. The chlorine vapor immediately irritated her airways, triggering violent coughing and burning in her lungs as she stumbled toward the door, but her eyes were burning so severely she couldn't see. The pool worker grabbed her and pulled her from the equipment room, immediately calling emergency services. He tried to keep her upright and breathing fresh air, but Candace was gasping and wheezing. Her coughing worsened, and she struggled to speak between breaths as responders noticed her oxygen levels dropping. Within minutes, pink-tinged foam appeared at her mouth, indicating severe fluid buildup in her lungs. Residual chlorine vapor continued venting from the equipment room, forcing evacuation of the pool deck until hazmat crews arrived. 3 swimmers experienced coughing and eye irritation from brief exposure. Paramedics arrived within 5 minutes and found Candace in severe respiratory distress with cyanotic lips, indicating oxygen deprivation. Paramedics noted severe respiratory distress consistent with chlorine inhalation as fluid rapidly began filling her lungs. Despite receiving emergency respiratory support, her damaged lungs could not exchange oxygen. She was airlifted to the regional medical center and placed on mechanical ventilation, but the extent of her lung damage was irreversible. She died 4 hours later from respiratory failure caused by acute chlorine gas poisoning. The pool area was sealed off, while hazmat teams spent 2 days ventilating the equipment room. Security footage confirmed that Candace had ignored all safety warnings and created the lethal gas cloud despite repeated attempts to stop her. It was September 12, 2015, in Tallahassee, Florida. A 110-foot cell tower stood inside a fenced gravel lot on the eastern edge of the city, surrounded by chain-link barriers and posted high-voltage warning signs. The isolated service site sat away from nearby homes, with electrical equipment humming at the base. A contracted tower technician, 52, had arrived earlier that morning to service ground-level components inside a metal cabinet near the base. The gate was typically kept locked, but he had left it temporarily unsecured while retrieving equipment from his truck parked just outside the perimeter. High-voltage warnings in faded yellow and black lettering were posted along the fence and cabinet doors. Mavia Klatt, 35, worked in a medical billing office and had spent months posting complaints online about poor cell reception in her neighborhood. She frequently tagged her service provider in public posts, accusing the company of negligence and overcharging customers. In messages and comment threads, she insisted the nearby tower was not functioning properly and stated she would personally intervene if the issue was not resolved. That afternoon, after another dropped call, she drove to the tower site. When she saw the gate partially open, she entered the lot and began calling out toward the structure, demanding an explanation for what she believed was ongoing service failure. The contracted technician was inside a ground-level cabinet and had temporarily unlocked the tower's climb shield to access the ladder, leaving it unsecured while retrieving equipment from his truck. Mavia walked directly to the exposed ladder system and began climbing without a harness, helmet, or fall protection. When the technician stepped outside moments later and saw her several feet above ground, he ordered her to come down and warned her that the equipment was energized. She continued ascending despite the warning, insisting she had a right to inspect what she believed was faulty infrastructure. She climbed to approximately 35 feet before slowing near a mounted junction assembly supplying power to transmission components above. As she steadied herself on the ladder, she reached toward a thick cable entering the housing, attempting to locate what she believed was the source of the service problem. Witness accounts described a sudden flash, consistent with an electrical arc, followed by a sharp cracking sound. Investigators later determined she likely contacted an energized component or created a conductive path between live equipment basement and the grounded tower. The resulting shock would have been instantaneous. Her body stiffened briefly before she lost muscular control. She fell backward from roughly 30 feet. During the descent, she struck a horizontal crossbrace about 10 feet below, altering her trajectory before dropping the remaining distance onto the gravel surface. The technician called emergency services immediately and approached without moving her, recognizing the risk of spinal injury. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. She was unresponsive, pulseless, and had sustained catastrophic trauma consistent with both high-voltage electrical injury and a fall from height. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be combined electrocution and blunt force trauma. The tower operator confirmed the structure, and electrical systems were functioning within regulatory standards at the time. No service malfunction was detected. Following the investigation, the contractor reinforced perimeter fencing, added redundant locking mechanisms to the gate, and reviewed site security protocols to prevent unauthorized entry during service intervals. Authorities ruled the death an accidental trespass-related electrocution resulting from unauthorized access to restricted infrastructure. Investigators found no evidence of equipment malfunction or operator negligence. Concluding the tower had been operating within regulatory standards, the case was closed without charges. It was October 9, 2015, at a remote campground in northern Idaho. Small cabins spaced out along a gravel loop, surrounded by trees, with just enough distance between them to feel separate. Once it got dark, everything went quiet. No traffic, no background noise, just still air and a steady drop in temperature. Carla Ives was 55 and staying alone for the weekend. She worked in retail management, and that need to be in control didn't really turn off when she left work. If something was labeled, limited, or set up a certain way, she didn't just follow it, she questioned it. And if it didn't make sense to her, she ignored it. She didn't like being told how much she could use or what something was for. If it looked available, she treated it like it was just sitting there going to waste. And if no one stepped in to stop her, that was enough for her to assume it wasn't a real rule to begin with. She had a habit of testing things like that, starting small, then pushing further once nothing pushed back. Near the main area, there was a large stack of firewood set aside for cabin use. It was clearly divided, so each cabin got a set amount, enough for a controlled burn. The wood itself was freshly cut, still green, heavier than dry wood, and not meant for indoor use in a closed space. That part actually mattered, but it wasn't something she thought about. She noticed the stack the first evening and paused for a second, just looking at it. From her point of view, it didn't make much sense. Why was there that much wood sitting there when she'd only been given a small bundle? It looked unused, untouched, so she decided it didn't add up. To her, it felt like overstock, like whoever set it up had misjudged how much people would need. And if it wasn't being used, then what was the issue? So she took some. At first, it was just an extra armful, easy to justify. No one said anything. No one came over to stop her. That was enough. Later that night, she went back and took more. The next day, she did it again. Another trip, another load. At that point, it wasn't about needing it anymore. It was about the idea that it shouldn't just be sitting there unused. She took more than she could realistically burn in one night, stacking it up like she was planning ahead instead of overdoing it. Instead of using it outside or burning it gradually, she carried most of it into her cabin and stacked it along one wall. She wanted it inside, within reach, so she wouldn't have to go back out in the cold. It felt more efficient to her. Everything in one place, no extra effort. That night, the temperature dropped quickly. She sealed the cabin up, windows closed, door shut tight to keep the heat in. The space was small, and once everything was closed off, the air inside stayed trapped. She started a fire in the stove using the wood she had taken, but green wood doesn't burn cleanly. It smolders more than it burns, producing heavier smoke and releasing more gases than properly dried wood. The stove still functioned, but without enough airflow, it didn't burn efficiently. After some time, she noticed the fire wasn't holding the way she expected. Instead of adjusting airflow or reducing the load, she added more wood to keep it going. That only made the burn less efficient, more smoke, more buildup, less clean heat. She kept the cabin sealed. After a while, she started to feel off. At first, it was mild, a headache, a little dizziness, a general feeling of fatigue, the kind of thing that's easy to ignore, especially when you're alone. She didn't change anything, didn't open a window, didn't step outside. She stayed where she was. As the night went on, the symptoms became more noticeable. The dizziness lasted longer. The fatigue got heavier. When she stood up, she had to steady herself for a second before moving. Her coordination wasn't as sharp, but even then, she didn't shift what she was doing. No ventilation, no fresh air. The fire continued to burn poorly. The air inside the cabin continued to change. At some point, the symptoms crossed from uncomfortable to disorienting. The kind where thinking clearly becomes harder, where reacting takes longer than it should. By then, the environment inside had already shifted too far. She remained inside. She was later found unresponsive in the cabin. The cause of death was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning. The sealed cabin and lack of ventilation had allowed gases to build up to fatal levels, and the green wood, which burns less cleanly than dried, had made the situation worse. The campground was reviewed, but no staff negligence was found. The firewood labeling was considered adequate, and the cabin stove was properly functioning. The green wood supply was moved to a locked enclosure with clearer posted signage afterward. The case was ruled accidental. It was March 8, 2016, at an electronics retail store in Dallas, Texas. The afternoon rush had filled the customer service counter with returns and exchanges, forming a slow-moving line that stretched into the main aisle. The air carried the steady noise of scanners, receipt printers, and overlapping conversations from impatient customers waiting their turn. Brenda Kowalski was 38 years old and had spent several years refining a method she relied on when returning electronics. She routinely purchased items, used them briefly, then claimed they were defective. When stores cited return policies or time limits, she escalated by refusing to leave the counter until someone relented. Employees at multiple locations had encountered her before, recognizing the pattern of persistence and confrontation. That afternoon, Brenda approached the counter holding a phone charger she had bought 2 months earlier. The original packaging was gone, the cord showed clear wear, and she had no receipt. When the cashier explained the store's 30-day return policy, Brenda raised her voice over the surrounding noise, accusing the store of unfair treatment. As the cashier attempted to assist the next customer, Brenda stepped directly in front of the counter, blocking access and declaring she would not move until her concerns were addressed. For the next 12 minutes, the return line stalled completely. Brenda remained planted at the counter, pulling out her phone and loudly dictating a formal complaint. Other customers shifted uncomfortably behind her as she accused the store of fraud and discrimination, repeating herself while refusing to step aside. The obstruction drew attention from across the sales floor, but Brenda showed no sign of backing down. Near the front of the store, the entrance area had recently been cleaned. Earlier, rain had been tracked inside, prompting staff to mop the tiled foyer leading to the automatic glass doors. Bright yellow wet floor signs stood at both ends of the entrance, clearly visible from several angles. Despite the cleanup, the smooth tile surface remained slick. When it became clear her return would not be accepted, Brenda abruptly turned away from the counter. Her face flushed as she announced she was leaving to handle the situation herself. Still holding her phone, she moved quickly toward the exit, her focus fixed on continuing her complaint rather than her surroundings. As she approached the entrance, an employee nearby called out, warning her that the floor was wet and slippery. Brenda did not slow down. She waved the warning away, dismissing it as unnecessary interference. Moments later, another warning followed as she neared the doorway, but she continued forward, treating the caution as an insult rather than a safety concern. Brenda deliberately stepped around the first wet floor sign with exaggerated care, as if proving a point. Her phone rang as she reached the open space before the automatic doors, and she continued walking at full speed. Near the threshold, she spun mid-stride to shout back toward the service area, insisting she knew how to walk and did not need advice. Her rubber-soled sneakers hit the freshly mopped tile as her weight shifted. Both feet lost traction at once. She slipped backward violently, her legs sliding out from under her as she fell. Her head struck the tile hard as her full body weight came down, and she remained motionless on the floor while nearby customers stepped back and store employees called for emergency assistance. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Brenda unresponsive with severe head trauma. Despite resuscitation efforts at the scene, she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The official cause of death was a fatal traumatic brain injury resulting from the fall. The investigation concluded that Brenda had been warned twice about the wet floor conditions and had ignored both posted signage and direct verbal warnings from staff, prioritizing her confrontation over basic safety. It was August 11, 2018, at a luxury hotel spa in Scottsdale, Arizona, where afternoon temperatures climbed past 105 degrees as guests moved between shaded courtyards and air-conditioned treatment rooms. Inside the resort's wellness complex, private hydrotherapy suites lined a quiet hallway reserved for premium clients who had booked extended packages costing several $100s per session. Becca Stewart, 46, had arrived alone that morning after checking into the hotel for a weekend stay. A regional sales manager known among co-workers and service staff for demanding special accommodations, she had booked the spa's longest private hydrotherapy session, insisting on the highest temperature setting and additional time beyond the standard reservation. Employees later stated that from the beginning of her appointment, Becca complained repeatedly about scheduling limits and water temperature, arguing that the price she had paid entitled her to unrestricted access. Staff documented that she requested the tub be raised to the maximum allowable heat and repeatedly reset the wall-mounted mechanical jet timer to keep the session running beyond its scheduled limit. The private suite contained a deep stone hot tub set to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest temperature permitted under state health regulations. A wall-mounted timer and intercom system allowed attendants to monitor session length and check on guests without entering the room. After 40 minutes, an attendant contacted Becca through the intercom and informed her that her scheduled time had ended and she needed to exit the tub and cool down before her next treatment. Becca refused, stating that she had paid for the room and would leave when she was finished. The attendant reminded her that prolonged immersion at that temperature could be dangerous and offered water and assistance. Becca declined both. 10 minutes later, staff contacted her again after noticing the session timer had been manually restarted. Becca again refused to exit, stating that the spa's time limits were unreasonable and that she would be filing a complaint with hotel management. The attendant documented that Becca sounded agitated and insisted she was feeling fine. At the 50-minute mark, another check-in was attempted. This time, Becca did not respond immediately. When she answered, her speech was slower, and she complained that the room felt too cold, requesting the water remain at its current setting. Surveillance cameras in the hallway later showed no staff entering the suite during the next 15 minutes. Inside the private tub, prolonged exposure to near-scalding water had begun lowering Becca's blood pressure while raising her core body temperature. The heat caused progressive dizziness, dehydration, and confusion. At approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes into the session, spa records indicated the intercom went unanswered. An attendant opened the suite door and found Becca slumped sideways in the tub, her face partially submerged and her body motionless. Steam filled the small room, and the water continued circulating at full temperature. Staff immediately shut off the jets and pulled her head above the surface while calling emergency services. Hotel security arrived within minutes and assisted with removing her from the tub and beginning CPR. Paramedics reached the spa shortly afterward and attempted advanced resuscitation, but Becca showed no signs of breathing or pulse. She was transported to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead less than an hour later. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be accidental drowning, with hyperthermia and prolonged hot tub immersion listed as contributing factors. Toxicology tests showed no alcohol or drugs in her system. There were no signs of trauma, restraint, or mechanical failure. Investigators reviewed spa records, surveillance footage, and staff statements. Documentation confirmed that the hot tub temperature remained within legal limits and that employees had warned Becca multiple times to exit the tub and cool down. The intercom logs showed she had deliberately restarted the session timer and refused assistance. The spa was cleared of wrongdoing. In the final report, investigators concluded that Becca lost consciousness from heat exposure and low blood pressure, slipped beneath the water's surface, and drowned before anyone noticed. Her death was ruled accidental. The hotel temporarily closed the hydrotherapy wing for inspection and later added stricter automatic shutoff systems to prevent extended private use. It was June 14th, 2016, along a Western Caribbean cruise route, the kind of stretch where the sea stays calm and the ship moves with a steady, almost mechanical rhythm. Inside, everything runs on systems most passengers never think about. Waste processing, maintenance corridors, and areas hidden behind plain doors marked for crew only. Those spaces feel unimportant from the outside, but they're some of the most controlled environments on the ship. Sophie Vran, 41, worked a mid-level retail job, and from everything later documented, she had a pattern of pushing back when rules didn't suit her. Not explosive, but persistent. The kind of person who treats policies as suggestions when they inconvenience her. She was traveling with 2 co-workers, treating the trip as a short break, but early on there were already small conflicts, complaints about restrictions, policies being over the top, and staff being unreasonable. Nothing that got her removed, but enough to form a pattern. Before boarding, passengers had been clearly informed that certain items weren't allowed. One of those was a handheld clothes steamer. Sophie brought one anyway. When crew conducted routine cabin checks, they flagged it immediately. Standard procedure. Items like that get confiscated and processed through controlled systems. Sophie pushed back, arguing it wasn't dangerous, that other ships allowed it, and that it was her property. Crew explained the policy again. Once confiscated, the item is handled in restricted crew areas. Passengers are never allowed to access. That should have been the end of it, but for Sophie, it wasn't. She kept bringing it up, insisting she'd just get it back herself. Not as a joke, as a plan. That mattered more than it sounded because those systems aren't designed with passenger safety in mind. They're standard. Later, CCTV shows Sophie moving through a service corridor with a tote bag. She passes a clearly marked door labeled for waste processing, covered in warnings: crew only, restricted access, hazard signage. A crew member had just exited moments before, and the door hadn't fully latched. Sophie notices, pauses, looks directly at the warnings, and still pushes it open. She goes inside anyway. Inside was a compact waste handling room with a loading hatch feeding a conveyor into a sealed compactor, industrial, active, and not meant for untrained access. Investigators later believed she was trying to retrieve the confiscated item, apparently assuming it had been routed somewhere through the ship's internal handling systems, possibly passing through areas like this. She found the intake hatch and tried to push a bag through, but the steamer casing jammed. That was another moment to stop, but instead, she escalated. She climbed onto a nearby metal platform and leaned into the hatch, trying to force it open. At that point, a crew member appears at the doorway. You can see the realization. She'd been caught. The crew member immediately calls out for her to stop and step away, moving closer to intervene. But instead of backing off, Sophie reacts defensively. She insists she knows what she's doing, brushing off the warning like it doesn't apply to her. When the crew member tries to get closer, she lashes out, grabbing loose items near her and throwing them in his direction, forcing him to hesitate and shield himself instead of closing the distance. Her upper body crosses the intake threshold as the conveyor keeps running, pulling unevenly at the jammed bag. Her weight shifts and, just like that, control is gone. With no guardrails or stable footing, she slips forward into the intake channel, pulled toward the compactor. The crew member rushes forward, but it's already in motion. Emergency stop procedures were triggered within seconds, and the system powered down under load. Crew secured the area immediately and restricted access as response teams arrived. By the time the machinery was fully halted and accessed, Sophie had sustained catastrophic crushing injuries with no signs of survivability. The aftermath was handled quietly, but with precision. Investigators reviewed access logs, CCTV footage, and equipment data, all of which confirmed the same sequence: unauthorized entry into a restricted waste processing area, direct interference with active machinery, and failure to comply with verbal warnings during operation. The final report listed the cause of death as fatal traumatic injuries resulting from entrapment in an active waste compactor system, following breach of a secured crew-only area. It was a weekday afternoon in the fall of 2018 in a mid-sized city in Ohio. The neighborhood was a typical urban residential area made up of older 3- to 4-story apartment buildings with shared hallways and rows of mailboxes near the entrances. One standard brick building sat along the block with a small parking lot in the back and a row of buzzers at the front door. Tamsin Brule was 38 years old and worked as a freelance data entry contractor. She worked from home most days and rarely left the apartment before noon. Her income was modest and inconsistent, and she had been in the same unit for just over 2 years. She was known among former co-workers as someone who kept detailed personal logs of perceived slights and was quick to escalate minor disagreements into formal disputes. She had contacted a tenant advocacy line twice in the prior year over issues that were ultimately found to be within her landlord's rights. She had sent formal written complaints about neighbors on at least 3 separate occasions. She was not someone who let things go easily. Her relationship with her landlord had been strained for several months over a single maintenance request she felt had been deliberately ignored. The request involved a slow drain in the bathroom that she had reported in writing more than once. The landlord had acknowledged it but had not sent anyone to fix it. Tamsin had begun documenting every exchange in writing and had told a friend she intended to build a case against him. 3 weeks before her death, she had come across a warning in an online community forum about the dangers of mixing certain household cleaning products. She had commented under the post that the warning was overstated and that people were being dramatic about basic cleaning supplies. On the morning of the incident, her landlord sent a message notifying her of an unscheduled walkthrough scheduled for later that afternoon. Tamsin had told the same friend that if the landlord ever scheduled a walkthrough, she would take it as retaliation for her complaints. Her ex-husband was also coming by that same afternoon to collect a remaining box of his belongings. She had mentioned to a friend the previous week that she wanted the apartment to look a certain way before he arrived. She cleaned the main rooms first and moved to the bathroom last. The bathroom was a small enclosed space of roughly 35 square feet with a single window and an exhaust fan above the tub. Under the sink, she had several cleaning products, including a bleach-based spray and a separate ammonia-based floor cleaner. She applied both to the floor and tub surfaces within a short period and began scrubbing. The bathroom door was closed, the window was shut, the exhaust fan was not turned on. The combination of the 2 cleaners in the enclosed space began producing chloramine gas almost immediately. Chloramine is colorless and has a sharp chemical odor that can be mistaken for a strong cleaning smell. In a small enclosed bathroom with no ventilation, the concentration can rise quickly. Prolonged exposure in that environment can cause severe respiratory irritation, shortness of breath, and confusion. Based on the physical evidence and the confined layout of the room, investigators concluded she was exposed to the gas for a sustained period without ventilation. The bathroom door and window remained closed. Her ex-husband arrived that afternoon as planned. He knocked several times and received no answer. The front door was unlocked. He entered and noticed a strong chemical smell immediately upon stepping inside. The bathroom door was closed. He opened it and found her on the floor near the tub. Both cleaning product bottles were found open on the bathroom floor. The window was confirmed shut, and the exhaust fan was confirmed off at the time her ex-husband found her. The front door had been unlocked, consistent with his account of entering without a key. The landlord's walkthrough had not yet taken place. A determination was made that acute respiratory failure due to chemical inhalation was the cause of death. Investigators concluded that the chloramine gas produced by mixing the 2 cleaners in the unventilated space led to the fatal exposure. The manner was ruled accidental. The ex-husband cooperated fully and was eliminated as a person of interest the same day based on the physical evidence and corroborating accounts of his whereabouts earlier that afternoon. No fault was assigned to any other party. The case was closed. It was July 18, 2016, in Mesa, Arizona. Afternoon temperatures had climbed above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, pushing most activity indoors. Along a commercial stretch of East Main Street, a small, independently operated hair salon occupied a single storefront. Sunlight reflected off the front windows across light-colored tile flooring. The air conditioning system ran continuously against the desert heat. 4 styling chairs faced wall-mounted mirrors, and a shampoo station sat behind a half-wall partition near the rear. Kestra Vant, 38, arrived for a scheduled haircut. She worked in an administrative role for a residential property management company, processing applications and handling tenant paperwork. Public online records later reviewed showed a pattern of detailed complaints about businesses she visited, often escalating minor issues into formal disputes. Former co-workers described her as highly particular and unwilling to concede when she believed standards were not met. The appointment began routinely. She presented a printed reference image and emphasized precision. The stylist, a woman in her mid-20s, employed at the salon for less than 2 years, completed the cut while the schedule ran slightly behind. After the haircut, Kestra stood and examined the neckline under brighter front lighting. 2 clients later told investigators she began identifying small differences between the result and the reference photo. The stylist offered to make immediate corrections. Kestra declined further adjustment and instead initiated a sustained argument about competence and professionalism. Witnesses stated her tone escalated. She questioned the stylist's training, criticized the delay, and referenced her history of posting public reviews. The stylist attempted to de-escalate and again offered to correct the cut at no charge. Kestra continued the confrontation, drawing attention from everyone inside. During the dispute, she shifted focus to the salon setup. She moved toward the shampoo area behind the partition, stating she intended to document what she described as unsafe conditions. The stylist advised her the wash station was restricted to staff. Kestra proceeded past the barrier despite the instruction. As she entered the area, the tile was damp from recent use. A commercial salon hairdryer sat beside the sink, powered by an extension cord running across the floor from a rear outlet. The basin still contained standing water from a prior rinse. Witnesses reported that Kestra gestured toward the equipment while continuing the argument. As she stepped forward, her sandal caught the extension cord stretched across the walkway. The cord tightened beneath her foot. She attempted to steady herself by reaching toward the countertop hairdryer, which remained plugged in. She lost balance and fell forward. Her forehead struck the rim of the sink before her upper body pitched into the basin. During the fall, the energized hairdryer slipped from her hand into the water while she remained in contact with it. Those present reported hearing a sharp electrical pop, followed by a steady humming sound. The device created a conduction path through the standing water and her upper torso. Electrical current traveled across her chest and right shoulder. Her muscles contracted involuntarily, preventing release. The head impact likely caused disorientation. The circuit did not immediately trip. The stylist moved to the rear outlet and disconnected the extension cord. By the time power was cut, Kestra was unresponsive against the basin. Staff lowered her to the floor and contacted emergency services. No breathing or pulse was observed. Responders arrived within minutes and documented cardiac arrest consistent with ventricular fibrillation. Defibrillation and advanced life support were initiated and continued during transport. Resuscitation efforts at a nearby hospital did not restore sustained cardiac rhythm. She was pronounced deceased later that afternoon. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be accidental electrocution with contributing blunt force head trauma. Electrical burn patterns supported the conduction pathway described by witnesses. A subsequent safety inspection cited improper extension cord placement in a wet area and lack of ground fault protection. Required corrections were completed before the salon reopened. Investigators concluded the electrocution occurred when the powered device entered standing water while she remained in contact with it inside a restricted workspace. The incident was classified as accidental. It was April 7, 2018, in Phoenix, Arizona, where the spring morning brought clear skies and temperatures in the comfortable mid-70s. The home improvement store opened its doors to weekend customers seeking supplies for various projects. In the electrical department, fluorescent lights illuminated rows of wiring, outlets, and tools, while safety pamphlets sat near the checkout counter. Shara Vunt, a 44-year-old insurance claims adjuster, entered wearing flip-flops and a sundress, carrying printouts from renovation websites. After receiving an $800 quote from a licensed electrician to rewire her kitchen outlets, she chose to handle the project herself, convinced that online tutorials had given her sufficient expertise. Before reaching the electrical aisle, she stopped at customer service to argue about the price of contractor-grade wire. She insisted an online listing should be honored in store, despite it being from a third-party seller. When the clerk explained the policy, Shara reacted with visible irritation, loudly criticizing the store's pricing and competence. Several customers turned to watch as she continued voicing her dissatisfaction. In the electrical department, a licensed electrician with over 20 years of experience attempted to explain the risks of working on energized residential circuits. Shara repeatedly interrupted him, correcting terminology and minimizing the complexity of the task. When he mentioned permits and professional installation requirements for energized residential circuits and 240-volt appliances, she dismissed the warning and implied he was exaggerating dangers to protect his trade. Her tone grew confrontational, and she suggested that safety concerns were merely tactics to discourage independent customers. The employee demonstrated how to use a voltage tester and emphasized that confirming a circuit was de-energized was standard safety practice. Shara declined the full explanation, purchased the device without opening it, and refused recommendations for insulated gloves and proper footwear, viewing them as unnecessary expenses. At checkout, she disputed an expired coupon and threatened to leave a negative review about staff professionalism. She eventually completed the purchase, visibly annoyed. By early afternoon, Shara returned home and began working in her garage, where the electrical panel controlled power to her kitchen. The concrete floor was damp from washing her car earlier, and a garden hose lay nearby. She wore the same flip-flops, their soles wet from the moisture on the floor. She located what she believed was the main breaker and switched it off, but it only disabled a secondary panel. The main 240-volt lines remained energized, carrying enough current to cause cardiac arrest. The voltage tester remained unopened on her workbench. She decided verifying the circuit would only slow her progress. Using old pliers with worn metal handles, Shara began stripping insulation from what she assumed was dead wire. The moment the metal touched the live 240-volt conductor, electrical current found a path through her body. Her wet flip-flops on damp concrete created an efficient ground connection, allowing current to pass from her hands through her torso to her feet, disrupting her heart's electrical rhythm. The shock caused her muscles to contract violently, preventing her from letting go of the pliers. Within seconds, her heart entered ventricular fibrillation as electricity disrupted its rhythm. Her diaphragm seized, stopping her breathing. Sustained contact caused severe burns at the entry and exit points before the circuit finally broke. Shara's neighbor discovered her body 3 hours later when she came to borrow a ladder. Shara was still gripping the pliers, with electrical burns visible on her hands and feet. Emergency services were called immediately. The fire department's electrical inspector determined she had been electrocuted by 240 volts while working on live wires. Investigators noted the circuit she contacted was not protected by a GFCI breaker, a factor that allowed the electrical current to continue uninterrupted. The voltage tester that could have confirmed the circuit was safe was still sealed in its packaging. The main breaker had never been turned off. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental electrocution, noting that wet conditions, metal tools, and energized household wiring had created a predictably fatal situation. Investigators concluded the energized circuit and wet conditions created a lethal combination. The homeowner's insurance claim was denied after investigators determined the damage resulted from unpermitted electrical work, leaving the family responsible for repairs. The house required complete rewiring before it could be sold. It was June 3, 2016, in a suburban neighborhood outside Sacramento. Quiet street, fenced yards, nothing unusual at a glance. Single-story homes, dry lawns, and low trees lining the fences. Close enough that it's easy to notice what your neighbors are doing without really trying. Sheila Durney was 49 and worked from home doing freelance bookkeeping, so she was around most of the day. Over time, she got used to treating the space around her like it was partly hers, even when it wasn't. If something crossed into her side, even a little, she acted like she had a say in it. She didn't ask, didn't check, and didn't like being corrected. When neighbors pushed back, she brushed it off or argued it down. She had a habit of minimizing things, turning someone else's concern into something small or exaggerated. In her mind, she wasn't crossing a line. She was just being practical. If it looked fine, then it was fine. The tree next door had branches that stretched over the fence just enough for the fruit to hang within reach. That was enough for her. She started picking from it regularly, not once in a while, but often enough that it became routine. Step outside, grab one, sometimes two, move on. She didn't think of it as taking something that wasn't hers. To her, it was just there. Accessible meant acceptable. Earlier that season, the neighbor had treated the tree with a systemic pesticide, one that's absorbed into the plant and carried into the fruit as it grows. It wasn't something you could rinse off. He had told her clearly not to eat anything from the tree, more than once. Simple, direct, nothing unclear about it. She didn't just ignore that. She decided it didn't apply. To her, it didn't make sense. The fruit looked normal, smelled normal, tasted normal. No residue, no strange texture, nothing that matched what she expected treated to look like. She assumed he was exaggerating or just trying to keep her from taking it. That assumption stuck, and she didn't revisit it. If anything, she leaned into it, kept picking the fruit, kept eating it, like the warning didn't matter. It became automatic, part of her day without much thought. The symptoms started gradually. At first, it was mild: nausea, a headache, general feeling of being off. The kind of thing you might write off as something you ate or just a bad day. She didn't stop. She didn't reconsider what she'd been eating. She just moved past it, but the exposure continued. Over the next few days, the symptoms became more noticeable. The nausea lingered. The dizziness showed up more often. There were moments where she had to steady herself, where her balance slipped just enough to notice. Her energy dropped, and normal tasks started taking more effort. And still, no change. Even as it got worse, she didn't adjust her behavior. Either she didn't connect it to the fruit, or she dismissed the idea entirely. She had already decided it was safe, and that decision didn't shift just because her condition did. She kept eating it. What she didn't realize was how the exposure worked. The pesticide involved was a restricted-use organophosphate, the kind that requires a licensed applicator and carries clear warnings about fruit consumption windows that can run weeks or even months. It wasn't something that caused an immediate reaction, but it built up in the body over time. Small amounts, repeatedly consumed, could accumulate to dangerous levels. By the time the symptoms became severe, that buildup had already reached a point her body couldn't recover from. She was later found unresponsive inside her home. When everything was reviewed, there were no signs of anything sudden or external. What stood out was the pattern. Fruit collected from the neighboring tree, partially eaten over several days. The timing of her symptoms matched that pattern. The treatment of the tree had been documented earlier that season, and the type of pesticide used was consistent with one that remains within plant tissue. The cause of death was determined to be pesticide toxicity from repeated ingestion. The neighbor was investigated but not charged. Authorities found no grounds to pursue it. The pesticide had been applied legally by a licensed contractor and was properly logged. The warning he had given her was corroborated by two neighbors who had been present during at least one of those conversations. There was no evidence he had encouraged her to take the fruit or had any reason to believe she was still doing so after the warning. The tree remained on his property. The case was formally closed as an accidental death. It was June 14th, 2017, at a grocery store in Tampa, Florida. The temperature had climbed to 92 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon, pushing shoppers indoors to escape the heat. The front end of the store stayed busy, with checkout lanes running steadily as customers moved through air-conditioned aisles stocked for summer sales. Diane Fitzgerald was 42 years old and well known for testing rules wherever she encountered them. She served on her homeowners association board and had developed a reputation for finding loopholes in policies most people accepted without question. Over time, she applied that same approach to shopping. Extreme couponing became a side business, with Diane purchasing large quantities of discounted products and reselling them online for profit. Her preparation was methodical. She studied store circulars, printed manufacturer coupons, tracked digital rebates, and planned combinations that pushed promotions to their limits. Her garage held stacks of boxed goods, bought cheaply through overlapping discounts. Many local stores recognized her pattern: long transactions, aggressive arguments, and refusal to accept policy explanations. Inside the checkout line, Diane unloaded a carefully selected batch of items, including several bottles of high-priced vitamins. The coupons she presented, however, did not match the brands required by the promotion. When staff explained the mismatch, Diane rejected the explanation outright. She accused the store of misleading customers and claimed the promotion was intentionally confusing. Rather than step aside, she positioned herself at the counter and refused to move, blocking the lane while repeating her complaints. The line stalled as other shoppers waited behind her. Diane pulled out her phone and began documenting what she described as unfair treatment, raising her voice as she listed grievances. Several minutes passed with no resolution. When it became clear the explanation would not change, Diane abruptly abandoned the checkout lane and headed deeper into the store, determined to prove her interpretation of the promotion was correct. She pushed her cart toward the vitamin aisle, continuing to argue aloud as she walked. The aisle was lined with tall metal shelving units, stacked with heavy bottles and containers. These fixtures were designed to support static product weight, not the forward force created by climbing or pulling items outward. Multiple warning signs posted along the aisle clearly prohibited customers from climbing shelves. Diane stopped beneath the top shelf, scanning labels for items that fit her coupon plan. A nearby employee offered to retrieve the products for her. She waved off the suggestion. Instead, she placed one foot on the bottom shelf, using it as a step, and reached upward. With each bottle she pulled forward, the load shifted away from the shelf's center of gravity. The shelving unit creaked under the changing weight. Diane continued pulling items toward herself, balancing bottles against her chest as she reached higher. The structure began to lean. In a neighboring aisle, a maintenance worker heard the sound of metal straining, but was too far away to intervene before the balance tipped. The shelving unit collapsed forward without warning. Metal framing and dozens of heavy containers fell directly onto Diane, pinning her beneath the structure. The crash echoed across the store as products scattered across the floor. Nearby shoppers screamed and rushed toward the aisle, but the weight of the fallen shelving made immediate rescue impossible. Employees called emergency services and worked to lift the unit as carefully as they could. Diane was found unconscious beneath the metal framework, suffering severe crush injuries to her chest and head. She showed no signs of recovery and died from massive trauma before paramedics could arrive. Authorities secured the vitamin aisle while an investigation was conducted. Inspectors determined the shelving had failed due to improper use rather than structural defect. Warning signs had been posted and assistance had been offered. The store later reinforced shelving throughout the location and adjusted product placement to reduce risk. Diane's death was ruled accidental, caused by unsafe climbing behavior that led to the collapse. It was March 15, 2017, in Clearwater, Florida, when late afternoon heat reached 89 degrees as shoppers crowded a suburban shopping center parking lot near the main highway. Brenda Caldwell, 42, arrived alone in her white Mercedes shortly after 3 o'clock. A real estate agent known locally for her aggressive negotiating style, she had spent the morning showing properties across Pinellas County. Witnesses later described her appearing visibly irritated as she circled the lot, leaning on her horn when cars hesitated at intersections. After several minutes, she pulled into an open space near the front walkway. Less than 30 feet away, near a concrete service wall beside a dumpster enclosure, a disheveled man sat on the ground, speaking quietly to himself. Several shoppers passed him without stopping. Brenda exited her vehicle and immediately noticed the man. Surveillance footage later showed her pausing beside her door, watching him for several seconds before walking in his direction rather than toward the store. As she approached, the man stood and began slowly walking past her toward the sidewalk. His posture was unsteady and his movements suggested intoxication. When he gestured in her direction, possibly asking for money, Brenda stopped in front of him. Witnesses reported that her voice quickly rose as she pointed toward the service area and began gesturing sharply. Several nearby shoppers turned to look. Security footage showed her stepping into his path, blocking him from continuing toward the sidewalk. The man attempted to move around her, but she followed. Continuing to gesture and wave her arms, she raised a phone as if preparing to call someone, then stepped closer, forcing him backward toward the parking spaces. As the confrontation drew attention, two bystanders later stated that Brenda appeared increasingly agitated, pacing and pointing while continuing to block the man's movement. The man's body language shifted as he backed away, keeping his hands close to his chest and glancing toward the exit lane. Instead of disengaging, Brenda advanced again. Surveillance showed her stepping off the curb into the parking lane, heels unstable on the uneven pavement. The concrete parking barrier behind her sat less than 2 feet away, marking the edge of the walkway. When the man attempted to move past her one final time, Brenda lunged forward and shoved him with both hands in the chest. The shove forced the man backward several steps. As he regained his balance, he extended his arms and pushed back in what investigators later classified as a reflexive defensive movement. The contact itself was not forceful, but Brenda had already been leaning forward in unstable footwear. The return push caused her to lose balance. Her left heel caught the raised edge of the concrete parking barrier behind her. With no space to recover, she fell backward violently. Her head struck the corner of the barrier before her body collapsed onto the asphalt. The man froze briefly, then fled across the driving lane and disappeared into traffic. Brenda remained motionless on the pavement. Blood began pooling beneath the back of her head as shoppers slowly approached. Several minutes passed before emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but pronounced her dead at the scene. Police later recovered surveillance footage from several parking lot cameras. The recordings showed Brenda stepping into the driving lane, blocking the man's path, and initiating the physical contact moments before the fall. Investigators interviewed 5 witnesses who confirmed that she had escalated the confrontation and shoved first. The man's return push was classified as a defensive reflex rather than an assault. The medical examiner later ruled the manner of death accidental, concluding the fatal injury resulted from the fall. The unidentified man was never located. Detectives closed the case without filing charges. It was March 9, 2017, along a Bahamas cruise route where the evening air stayed warm and steady, and inside the dining area, everything followed a familiar flow. Plates moved from kitchen to table, staff navigated tight spaces, and conversations blended into a low, constant noise. Nothing about the room demanded attention. Davina Squab was 52, working in a customer-facing role, and from what was later documented, she relied heavily on her own judgment when something felt minor. If a problem didn't seem serious, she treated it that way, and when others disagreed, she dismissed them, framing concern as unnecessary interference. Earlier that day, she went to the ship's medical area because of chest discomfort. The recommendation was simple: further evaluation. She declined, questioning the need for tests and insisting staff were overreacting. When advised again, she became impatient, stating she knew her own body better than anyone there before leaving against guidance. The interaction was recorded. The symptoms didn't resolve and persisted throughout the day. By dinner, nothing outwardly seemed wrong. She sat, ordered food, and stayed engaged. To others, it looked normal, not the continuation of something already developing. Then, small changes began. Pauses when shifting, hesitation before standing, one hand resting on the table longer than expected. Individually, nothing stood out. Together, something was off. The disagreement started over her meal. When it arrived, she said it wasn't prepared as requested. The waitress offered to fix it, but the interaction shifted. What should have been simple escalated. Her tone sharpened, cutting off explanations and redirecting blame toward staff, as if the situation needed to stay under her control. This is where the cruise roll becomes the focus of the investigation. At least 2 dining staff observed visible changes in her condition during the dispute: sweating, postural instability, labored breathing. One staff member, per later testimony, recognized the signs as potentially medical and considered radioing for assistance. That call was not made. Instead, the priority remained de-escalating the service complaint. A supervisor was contacted, not medical personnel, and the supervisor's instruction was to manage the guest and avoid drawing attention to the situation on the floor. That decision created a gap. Had the radio call gone to medical at the point when symptoms were first observed, estimated to be roughly 11 to 14 minutes before collapse, response personnel would have been en route while she was still conscious and responsive. The ship's medical team was stationed 2 decks below. Standard transit time to the dining area was under 3 minutes. Instead, no call was made until she fell. Her stability continued to decline. She leaned harder on the table, her grip tightening as her breathing grew heavier. Witnesses noted the mismatch, the argument still ongoing while her body was visibly failing underneath it. The room kept moving. Staff nearby continued managing the floor. Then it gave out. Her grip tightened briefly before she dropped forward, striking the table and falling unresponsive. There was no attempt to break the fall. The radio call went out at that moment, not before. Crew responded. The area was cleared and medical personnel arrived, but the timeline now carried weight. From the point symptoms were first observed to the point the medical team was contacted, approximately 13 minutes had passed. From contact to arrival, 3 more. total elapsed time between first visible signs and the beginning of resuscitation efforts, 16 minutes. In cardiac events of this type, that window is not neutral. It is the margin. Resuscitation was attempted. Despite sustained effort, there was no return of stable vital signs. Investigators reviewed the full sequence: her earlier refusal of evaluation, the progression during dinner, the staff observations, the supervisor's decision, and the delayed call. The findings were not confined to her choices alone. The report acknowledged that her refusal of medical care earlier in the day was a contributing factor. It also concluded that trained crew members identified visible distress consistent with a medical emergency and did not act on established protocol. The supervisor's instruction to prioritize guest management over medical escalation was flagged as a procedural failure. The final report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest following an untreated myocardial infarction. A secondary finding noted that crew response delay reduced the probability of successful intervention, and that the outcome, while not certain to have been different, was made significantly less recoverable by the time resuscitation began. Davina Squab didn't collapse without warning. Neither did the response. Both had room to go differently, and in this case, the one that could have been controlled wasn't. That's what the investigation found, and that's what made it harder to close. It was the afternoon of March 14, 2016, in Flagstaff, Arizona. A small ceramics and pottery studio tucked along a quiet commercial strip was running its usual weekday class, the kind of place that smelled like wet clay and wood polish. It was the kind of place where people came to slow down, which made what happened that afternoon all the more avoidable. Nadine Feller, 47, worked as a property manager on the north side of Flagstaff, handling a small group of rental units and coordinating repairs for owners who relied on her judgment. Over time, that authority kind of followed her everywhere. She walked into any space like it was partly her responsibility. If something felt off to her, she'd say something. Sometimes she'd just step in and fix it herself. She signed up for a beginner pottery class 3 weeks earlier after her doctor suggested finding a low-stress hobby. Since then, she'd already complained about the class schedule, mentioned the room temperature more than once, and questioned the type of clay being used. She wasn't really there to learn ceramics. It was more about being comfortable and feeling in control. By week 3, people had started to notice and quietly adjusted around her. That afternoon, a kiln was running in the back workroom. An older electric model, sturdy and a bit dated. The instructor had started it before class, and a low hum carried into the studio. Most people tuned it out pretty quickly, but Nadine, not really. About 20 minutes into class, she spoke up, loud enough that everyone heard. The instructor explained the kiln was in the middle of a firing cycle and couldn't be stopped without ruining the pieces inside or damaging the kiln. Fair enough, right? She let it go for maybe 15 minutes. Then she brought it up again, more firmly this time. She said the noise was giving her a headache and asked why she had to sit through it. The instructor gave the same answer and went back to helping another student. Nadine stayed at her station, hands on her clay, clearly not okay with it. Not the kind of quiet where you move on, the kind where you're thinking, so what now? The kiln kept humming. Her irritation didn't go anywhere, and eventually those two things turned into a decision that made perfect sense to her, and none at all to anyone else. While the instructor was occupied with 2 students at the front of the studio, Nadine pushed back her chair and walked down the hallway to the back workroom. She located the power cable along the base of the kiln and unplugged it from the wall outlet. The hum stopped immediately. She stood there for a moment in the sudden quiet, apparently satisfied. Then she reached for the latch on the kiln door and pulled it open. The heat that pours from a kiln running at approximately 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't announce itself. Nadine caught the full force of it the moment the door swung open. Face, throat, lungs, before she could step back. A student in the hallway saw her stagger and collapse against the wall. The instructor arrived within moments to find her conscious but struggling to breathe, with visible burns around her nose and mouth. Emergency responders transported her to a nearby medical facility. She was alert on arrival, though her voice had already gone rough and thin. The burns to her airway were extensive, and swelling set in over the following hours. Despite the efforts of the medical team, her condition declined steadily through the night. Nadine Feller was pronounced dead in the early hours of the following morning. In the weeks that followed, local authorities reviewed the incident. Witness accounts from the student in the hallway and the others in the main room were consistent throughout. The kiln had been operating normally, and the studio had followed every reasonable procedure. The decision to unplug the unit and open the door had been made entirely by Nadine, without prompting from anyone. The case was ruled an accidental death and closed without further action. The instructor was cleared. Witness accounts confirmed no one had directed Nadine toward the back room. The studio reopened the following month, and the kiln was returned to use without issue. It was a weekday afternoon in the late summer of 2018 in a mid-sized suburban neighborhood in North Carolina. The area was a typical post-2000 residential development with single-family homes sitting on modest lots, shared driveways, and streets wide enough for two cars to pass without slowing. The houses on that block were owner-occupied for the most part, and most of the neighbors had lived there long enough to know each other by name, if not by much else. Paulette Hinshaw was 49 years old and worked part-time as a receptionist at a chiropractic office. She spent most of her evenings at home and handled most household maintenance decisions herself rather than deferring to outside help. She had hired and formally disputed payment with 3 separate contractors in the prior 2 years over work she deemed unsatisfactory after the fact. She was known in the neighborhood for leaving detailed negative reviews of local tradespeople online within days of hiring them, sometimes before the work was even fully complete. Among former co-workers, she had a reputation for consulting online tutorials as a substitute for professional advice and then attributing poor results to the tutorial rather than her own execution. A contractor had completed a partial kitchen renovation at Paulette's home several weeks prior. In the weeks following, she noticed the kitchen light fixture flickering intermittently. She contacted the contractor several times over a 2-week period and received no response after the 3rd attempt. Rather than hiring a new electrician, she looked up several online tutorials about replacing hardwired light fixtures. She had replaced a bathroom light fixture 2 years earlier without issue and proceeded on that basis. On the afternoon of the incident, she gathered the tools she needed and set up a step stool beneath the kitchen fixture. Before climbing up, she turned the wall switch off. She did not go to the breaker panel to cut power to the kitchen circuit. The kitchen floor had a linoleum surface that had been lightly damp from mopping earlier that afternoon. She was wearing socked feet. The kitchen fixture was a hardwired unit mounted to a ceiling junction box. Although the wall switch was off, investigators determined live voltage was still present inside the box. Cutting power at the breaker panel is the only reliable way to fully de-energize a circuit before handling exposed wiring. Paulette climbed the step stool and removed the fixture cover. She disconnected the old fixture from the wiring inside the junction box and began handling the exposed wire ends. While doing so, she made simultaneous contact with both the live and neutral wires with her bare right hand. She was standing on a damp linoleum floor in socked feet at the time of contact. The combination of simultaneous wire contact and the conductive path through her body to the damp floor was sufficient to cause cardiac arrest. She fell backward off the step stool onto the kitchen floor. The step stool landed on its side beside her. Her neighbor had arranged to come by that evening to retrieve a set of garden tools she had borrowed from Paulette 2 weeks earlier. She knocked several times and received no answer. She noticed the lights were on inside, and Paulette's car was in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. She entered and found Paulette on the kitchen floor. The fixture was partially disconnected and hanging from the junction box above. The wall switch was confirmed in the off position at the time of examination. The breaker for the kitchen circuit was confirmed still on. The damp condition of the floor surface was noted and consistent with Paulette having mopped earlier that afternoon. The neighbor's account of the prior arrangement to collect the garden tools and her discovery of Paulette was consistent with the physical evidence at the scene. The cause of death was confirmed as electrocution and ruled accidental. The contractor was interviewed and confirmed he had not been in contact with Paulette in the weeks prior to her death and had no involvement in the circumstances. No fault was assigned to any other party. The case was closed without further action against any individual.